welcome to the Art of Being Human. Now, the last segment I talked to you about a couple of case studies in which people reacted to stress in different kinds of ways. There was one person who hid for 32 years because he thought that they were hunting for him, that the police were hunting for him, and he kept himself out of harm's way by not having any interactions with people except his family for a third of his life. And so he hid from his fears. And of course, there was the other person that I talked about because of the fact of how he responded, and it was important for him to get away from it. And so what I wanted to do today was to talk to you about a couple of case studies of people who responded to stress in a different kind of way, because I'm trying to point out something. You know, people do react to stress in different ways, and stress is a hard thing to cope with. And when you're in kind of a situation that's bad, what are you going to do about it, and how are you going to handle it? And if you're having anticipatory anxiety and you're fearful about something, then how are you going to handle that? Well, I'm going to talk to you about a couple. This is a true story, and it concerns a couple who were Canadian, and they were on a vacation. I'm going to call them Stan and Joan, but that's not their real names, but it wouldn't matter because it's a published report, so therefore it's not confidential. So at any rate, they were Canadian. They were in an accident. They were traveling on a vacation. The two of them, they were driving. Things were going well. It's a man and his wife. And suddenly there was a terrible accident involving a semi-truck, an 18-wheeler. And cars were piling on top of each other. It was a 17-car pileup. And when they had the pileup, there were people who could not get out of their cars. One car caught fire, and the young lady who was driving it could not get out of it, and so therefore died in the car fire because she couldn't get out of her car. And then there were kind of all kinds of damage all the way around. They had to cut this couple, Stan and Joan, out with jaws of life, and they cut metal and all of that in order to get them out. And it's just a horrific thing. They saw people hurt, they saw people injured, they saw cars crunched up against one another, people who couldn't get out of their cars, people who could hardly breathe, and the crying and the screaming, all of that. It was a horrendous, horrendous thing. And the fire where the woman was killed, that was awful. They saw that. They couldn't get out of their car to help, and they were injured themselves. So when they got out of their car, they were cut out. The man showed Stan showed all kinds of PTSD symptoms, which you would expect. He was hot, he was sweaty, he was afraid, he had anxiety, he had depression, he had all of those symptoms that you can say are PTSD symptoms. Now, Joan was different. She sat there still. She never said anything. It was like she was in a trance. As a matter of fact, she was in a trance. She didn't respond. She didn't talk. She didn't try to get out. She was just like a little statue, just sitting there. They had to remind her, we're taking you out of the car now. And she sat there, she let them take her out, but she was like a statue in that position, never saying anything, never doing anything. Now, this is a dissociative response, and it's called depersonalization. Dissociation is the response where you phase out. It's like you go into your own space. You're not in touch with anything that's going on around you. You're just sitting there. Now, a lot of people do have dissociation, but not to that degree. A lot of people do things like, supposing you're driving on a highway, and you have to take an exit to get to wherever you want to be, and you start thinking about something. You're conscious of the fact that you're driving, you're conscious of the traffic, but you're thinking about something else, something you're going to do, something you have done, just something else. You're in a different space. And what happens is you miss the exit. And when you miss the exit, you travel a while, and all of a sudden you realize, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I've missed my exit. So you have to get off at the next exit, go back and kind of retrace your steps. People do that all the time. That is a very mild form of dissociation. You phased out, you're mentally somewhere else. Now, there are a lot of different degrees of it, but she had a pretty serious degree of it. She wasn't responding to people. If you see somebody in their imaginative space, you can usually talk to them or say something and they come right out of it. She had a problem coming out of it. She was going to stay there. That was her response to the stress of it. So they got her out, they sent her to the hospital, and for years later, they're still suffering from that accident because they've got PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. He still has periods of time where he was getting anxious and depressed and nervous and thinking about what happened before and being maybe afraid to drive again because of the fact that, what if it happens again? You know, what if it happens again? And when she was talking about it or not talking about it, when she was reminded of it or something was mentioned to her, she resumed that dissociative stance. She sat there and she wouldn't say anything, and she just remained just statue-like. That was her response, and that continued. She dissociated for years down the line. Now, fortunately, they both got treatment to help them with that. But that shows you the differences of where people are when they have stress and they can't stand it. Now, remember, we've talked about the brain a little, and we've talked about the brain that when you go through something, your brain records everything. It's like a tape recorder, and then it stays there. And the thing is, you may think that you're healed because you may not be thinking all the time about that bad thing that happened, whatever it was. Maybe you were raped, maybe you were mugged, or whatever it was. It doesn't have to be an auto accident. You can respond to any number of situations that are hard on you. Maybe it was a divorce, maybe it was something else. But at any rate, it still bothered him. He still went into anxiety, and she resumed that state of statuesque. I'm going to say she was statuesque, numb, not saying anything, not feeling anything. And when they were asked in therapy to deal with it, what would happen is that he would go into anxiety, and she would just sit there and say, I don't think of anything. I don't feel anything. Remember, one of the case studies that I gave you last time was the fact of the teacher who had been threatened. His life had been threatened. He quit his teaching position and he became a hoarder. That hoarder is a part of a reaction that he had. The more things he had, the more he was protected. He used all of the things that he had as a protection so people wouldn't come in and hurt him, so that the student who threatened his life wouldn't be able to get to him. That's highly symbolic, of course, but that's what it was. The other man who had that stress hid in a barn for 32 years. Now, neither of these are good reactions. If you have reactions because something has happened to you, then you have to get help with that because you can't do it on your own. So they got the help, and I'm hoping that what happened, although I don't know as I could follow it to the end of the therapy, that she would be able to start feeling something, and she would be able to talk about it rather than being mute. And the only thing she would say to her therapist was, I can't feel anything. You know, I just can't feel anything. I'm numb. But how many people go into a reaction, they're numb, something happens and they're numb. They're doing the same kind of thing, but maybe not to the extreme that she did. Help is available, but you have to realize that all your emotions have to be expressed. Everything that you do has to be expressed. And if it's not expressed inwardly or outwardly, I mean, it's going to be one or the other. You can have an inward expression of your grief, or you can have an outward expression. Outward expression is basically more healthy than keeping everything in. If you're only going to not feel, the body's going to take the hit somehow. And you need to have that expressed, and you need to get help with it. Well, I'm going to tell you another story about a dog. Now, I happen to love pets, but this is about a dog. I watched it on a television show, and when I didn't catch the beginning of the show, but when I watched it, when I turned on the TV, there was a man sitting in a dark room. He was sitting on the floor, Indian style, and with him was a handful of treats, dog treats. He had a whole bowl of dog treats, and in it was a very frightened little dog. And the dog wanted the treats, but he was too afraid to come. So he would come closer and closer and closer, and the man would give him a treat, which he would accept, and then the man would touch him, just gentle touch. And he'd back off, he was afraid, and he'd bark. But then he'd circle around again and go up for another treat, and the man didn't say anything. He didn't say the word. He just sat there with the treat, and the dog came closer and closer and closer, and he took a little bit of a treat. He handed him this treat. He took it, and he touched him. And then the dog jumped back in fear. What had happened, I didn't know it at the time, what had happened was the dog either had been hit or abused or something. I think it had to do with an accident in which he was hit. I don't remember for sure, though. And he became so terrorized, he couldn't stand a human touch. He was just afraid of being hurt again. And so what the man was doing, and I realized later at the conclusion of the show, because I watched it through the whole thing, even though I didn't see the beginning, the dog got closer and closer and started to trust him a little more, and he started giving him more treats and touching him a little more. Not a lot, not a pressure, just a little touch. And the dog got to the point where he got to trust him a little, and he became conscious of that, and he didn't resist the touching quite so much, and he took his treats more easily. Now, I watched this for quite a while. This was probably an hour show, at least an hour show, and I watched it through its conclusion. Toward the end of the show, the dog was walking up, expecting his treats, expecting to be patted, and by the end of the show, the dog actually trusted this person so much that he came up, sat on his lap, and waited to be patted as he was given his treats. At that point, the lights went on, and I realized there was a whole audience. It was perfectly quiet. No one said anything. The man didn't say anything to the dog. And I think what happened was before the show began, they had been told that there can't be any sound, because if you spook the dog, he's not going to be able to go through with it, and he's going to trot off, and that's going to ruin the whole thing. There was absolutely no lights and absolutely no sound. The only light was the man sitting on the floor with his treats and the dog. You'd think there was no other people around, but there was a whole studio around. And then when the dog crawled up in the lap and wanted to be patted and wanted his treats at the same time, the lights went on, and the man got a standing ovation, and there was thunderous applause, and I realized what had been going on all the time. What was the dog? What happened with the dog? He was healed. He was healed, at least the human touch, or that person didn't scare him anymore, and the human touch didn't scare him anymore. As a matter of fact, he wanted it. So what happens when you have all of that stress and you're trying to either hide from it, you become a hoarder, or you hide in your barn, or whatever happens, whatever thing you do, you have to face the thing that caused you to have that intense anxiety to begin with. With the dog, it was the touch. And it was the touch that he was afraid of, and ultimately it was the touch that healed him, because he was able to face. Now, we all have pets, a lot of us, and we know they're intelligent. They think, they know. They're not human beings, but they have a lot of the same reactions that humans would have. You know, under certain circumstances, they get fearful, and you can heal them too. But he wanted this man's touch, and the man gave him his treats and touched him and so forth, and he was healed. So you face that which bothers you, but you do it in a safe environment. It's a little bit like desensitization. What happened with the dog is he gradually got so he was more comfortable with the thing that made him afraid. In desensitization, you become more comfortable with that which makes you afraid. If you're afraid to cross bridges, we don't say, okay, you got to cross a bridge and you'll be well. No, we don't do that. We take it on a much more gradual basis. Here are some pictures of a bridge. Look at the pictures of the bridge. How does it make you feel? Already the person who's afraid of bridges is having a panic reaction just by looking at the picture. And so you have to be gradual about it. There are some therapists that use something called flooding. They put a person in the middle of what they're afraid of, and the person is in a dead panic. But when they get through it, if they get through it all right, they realize nothing bad happened. I don't like to use that approach. I don't think that's fair. I think a much gradual, safer approach is much better, easier to handle, and you get the same results. It may take longer, but so what? You get the same results, and the person doesn't have to be in a dead panic as they're going through it. So therefore, I knew about a little girl who was afraid to go to school. I don't know what happened, but she was afraid. She had friends. It wasn't like she was being bullied, but she had a fear of going to school. So instead of putting her in a classroom, which scared her half to death, we let her go into the school. Look at the school. There are a bunch of rooms here. Right now, there's nobody there. Go back to the school when there are people there. Don't go into a classroom, but observe the fact that there are children and there are people walking around in the halls, and that's okay. You're not being hurt by that. What happens is you have to know that what was frightening to you before doesn't have any more power over you. You may remember it, but instead of causing you to panic, you can remember it as something that happened way back when. And it may not be totally comfortable, but you don't have to go into a fear reaction. It's over, it's done with. We don't expect it to happen again. Maybe there's a tiny, tiny sliver of a chance that it'll happen again, but we don't expect it to happen again. And so therefore, it's pretty safe to go out and drive. It doesn't mean you'll never be in another accident, but probably nothing caused by a big rig, and probably nothing that causes a jam up of 17 cars. I can't say it would never happen, but the chances are remote. Now, if you're safe about it and you don't have to drive, when it's bad, don't go out. That keeps you the safest of anything. But we have to get to the point where we can face something and know that it's not going to hurt us. Now, there are a lot of things and a lot of types of therapy that you can get in order to heal from a dramatic and a traumatic event. And most of them have something in common. What they have in common is that they get to distract you. You get to think. In fact, they want you to think about the thing that bothers you. They want you to bring up those emotions. And as you're bringing up those emotions, because you will, otherwise you wouldn't have a problem to begin with, then you do certain things that distract you. So you may be blinking your eyes, or you may be doing something else, or you may be counting, or whatever. There are different plans. There are different things you can do. EMDR has a plan that's very good, and you can have happening. That's a newer one that I've been studying lately. And the thing is, as you're facing the thing that scares you half to death, you're distracted by something else. You're looking at something else. You see, I think with the dog, he was fearful of the human touch. His distraction was he wanted the treat. And he wanted the treat badly enough that he was willing to risk being touched, even though it was uncomfortable, until the touch became familiar and was no longer fearful. You need to face it, but you need to face it in a gradual basis in a protected environment, especially if it's deep-seated, so that the therapist can help you through it, can kind of talk you through it, and you do it gradually. And some of these things, some of these therapies, what they do is they have you looking at a distance, rubbing your arm, singing some kind of a song like Mary Had a Little Lamb, just a little ditty, and it takes your mind off from the thing that you're so fearful about. At the same time, you're thinking about that thing, but the amount of distraction is there, and so therefore the anxiety level goes way down. Now, I'm not being a therapist on television, so I'm going to suggest, if you're interested in EMDR, I will be getting to it a little later anyway. I'm not going to teach you how to do it. It's not hard to do. You can learn how to do it. I would suggest that you go online or see a therapist that's trained in it, one or the other, and get to do it correctly. These plans are not, they're not invasive. You're not injecting something or taking a pill or drinking a liquid. They're things that you are physically doing that are not harmful, not invasive, will not hurt you, but will distract you enough so that it'll bring the anxiety level down. And it's something that you can do anytime you need to do it, anytime you want to do it, 100 times a day if you want to. And at some point, they'll be effective in reducing your anxiety to the point where you start to be able to think about a traumatic event without having the emotional response that you normally would have in a traumatic event. And the traumatic event is what caused the PTSD to begin with, what caused the trauma to begin with. You know, maybe you were shot at, maybe you were mugged, you know, maybe something else happened and you were physically pushed, you know, and I think that, you know, we all have something that happened to us that can be scary. Maybe you get locked in someplace and you were afraid you couldn't get out. I knew a woman, and it didn't happen to me personally, but it was my car. She was afraid of being locked in, and she had a really severe panic disorder in terms of being locked in anywhere. Elevators were horrible for her because what if she couldn't get out? What if it stopped between floors? All of that kind of thing. And so she was sitting in my car. I got out of the car. I was going into some place. I'll be right out. You'll only be here for a minute. And I realized that she thought she was locked in the car and couldn't get out. She thought I wasn't going to come back. Well, of course I was coming back. The car was in my own driveway, you know. And I just went into the house after something to come back after it. And so therefore she was sitting there. It wouldn't have been more than a minute or two. By the time I got back out, she's pounding on the window, let me out, let me out, let me out. And she's pounding on the window. I thought she was going to break it. And I said, you're fine. I opened the door, and she says, don't ever do that to me again. Well, what did I do? I left her sitting in a car by herself, and she somehow tricked herself into thinking she was locked in and could not get out of the car. All she had to do was pull up the door handle. You know, it's really hard to get locked inside a car unless you have an automatic lock that you can't release for some reason. So I'll give you this heads up. If you are driving a car, and this has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but just for your own personal safety, if you are driving a car and it has automatic locks, so when you drive, all the doors automatically lock, make sure you are able to get out of the car and bypass that system. On most cars, you could just lift up the handle or lift up the little lock there and you could get out. But in some cars, those locks are closed till you turn off the car or whatever it is. But the thing is, I've known people to die in locked cars because the whole system shorted out and they couldn't get out, and they didn't have a way to get out because they were in an accident and the locks froze. They were automatic locks, and they froze, and you couldn't get them unlocked. And people were trapped inside their car, not able to get out of their car, and as a consequence died in their car. I know because it happened to a friend of mine. So if you are driving one of those cars, get yourself a real hammer. You can buy them. They're 4 windows, so you can smash windows and get out of the car in an emergency in case the door locks freeze. I have an older car and I don't have to worry about it, but I prefer a car in which I have to lock it by pressing it down, lifting it up, so it takes 2 seconds longer. It's in my control. If I had to get out in an emergency, it wouldn't be a problem. I could do it. But some of these locked new cars, you can't do that. So you need to have a hammer. A special hammer has been made you can buy to smash windows so that you can crawl out of your car in an emergency if you're in an accident. Well, I'm going to close this segment here. We're going to continue with this. We're going to go into frustration and frustration tolerance and what it is and how you can help yourself with that next time. So please join me next time.